probably best to start with you and tell us a bit more about how all that came to be and what that tells us about the unexpected opportunities that we might find in the commercial use of space.
I'm surprised and delighted to see a video introducing, in a way, Maxar. Maxar is the new name. October 2nd, we closed a pivotal acquisition for us, Digital Globe. Maxar is a very diversified space company right now. It's about $3 billion revenue in 2016, 6,500 people. We do a number of things. We started the legacy, primarily business with SSL and communications. We do Earth observation satellites. We do imagery as well. We do space robotics. We are doing some science mission, and we are venturing in servicing on space as well. We serve commercial customers. We do government, obviously, missions, and we also do international as well. For us, the combination of all these capabilities with SSL, MDA in Canada, Digital Globe, and Radiant Solutions, I think is the first opportunity for us to really have an end-to-end view, not only about the infrastructure that we can help any kind of mission with, but the analytics and insights they can really derive when you put together both optical as well as radio type imagery. So I can't be more excited to be here, frankly. And just somebody may have noticed, not exactly what I call an insider to the industry. I've been here for about 4 months, and I'm still in the learning mode, but super excited to be joining this. And today, hopefully, we can contribute to have some ideas on what we're going to go next.
Excellent. So the idea of this, this session is that we focus on the Earth, and we focus on, rather like we just heard in the previous session, kind of looking back at the Earth, and what are the opportunities that, that we have from Earth orbit, and in particular, how can we use them to improve things on Earth. We just had a very striking example of that, but there are many others as well. Just staying with you there briefly, Dario, you covered several of the obvious ones there. So communications, something we do a lot of, but a lot of people think there's a big opportunity to do a lot more of it. Imaging, robotics. Where do you see one of those as kind of being a bigger opportunity than the others, or was it all about kind of hedging your bets and doing all of them?
Well, I'm not sure it would be fair to prioritize or compare, but certainly two in particular are the ones that I think are here and now. The first one is the communication side. A couple of statistics that probably every one of you know, but there are about 3 to 4 billion people on the planet that don't quite have yet adequate internet access. In the US alone, there are about 10% of the population, 34 million or so, that do not have 25 megabits a second or so of internet access. The rural population is about 40% of it, 24 million people, do not have access. So if you think about what is happening right now with not only geostationary satellites, but the entire, I call it massive investment that hopefully is going to materialize with a number of LEO constellations, we have an opportunity to truly move the needle when it comes to connecting the planet. The consequences of that are somewhat self-evident. Telemedicine, remote learning. So that's the whole area. The Earth imaging side, it is fascinating. I must admit, I'm a bit of a newbie, but every time I think about the use cases and the insight and analytics that you can get, not just by having accuracy in the imaging itself, but being able to detect motion and being able to actually focus on what is being changing, the use cases on that one, we can probably spend an entire morning on that. So these are the two primary, I call it, commercially driven type areas, as opposed to the previous panel being a bit more focused perhaps on where do we go next in terms of exploring the outer frontier.
Right. And just before we move off imaging, I'm sure we'll come back to this, but to what extent do you drive the uses of that imagery, and to what extent do people come to you and make unexpected use of it? I mean, we're familiar with the idea that you can use satellite imagery to measure crop health and so on, but is it sort of market pull, or is it vendor push on how the imagery that you produce is actually used?
It's a combination of both, actually, Tom, because on one side, there is a desire to want to create the usual word, a healthy ecosystem. So think about, imagery capturing. Really, the value gets created when you have a database of images, both optical and radar, and now you enable an entire ecosystem of software developers, companies that can specialize on verticals. But there are a number of missions that are more driven sometimes by classified, conversations and missions that we have with government. It's a combination of pull and pull, actually.
Is this, the example we just saw about the slave boats, was that the sort of the most unexpected use that's been made of your images, or have there been other strange things that have been done with satellite imagery that you kind of wouldn't have thought of yourself?
Yeah, this is the most public one. There are a number of others that we have in general, but the most publicized one is because this is probably at the core of what you can really do from a
Brilliant. Brian, I wanted to come to you next. The Secure World Foundation, what's its mission and how does it fit into this discussion?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Our mission is we're focused on trying to enhance the long-term sustainability of space for benefits back here on Earth. So a big part of our mission is the sustainability bit we're going to talk about later today with space debris and spectrum congestion. But the whole reason we do that is so we can continue to use space in the future for benefits like we just talked about this morning, and all the ones we have yet to explore. And for us, this is an exciting time because, as we just talked about with the case of tracking the slaving going on the ships, there are all these new applications and innovations that are coming, not only from the new technologies to be developed in the commercial world, but also from people seeing that and saying, hey, I have a problem, and that might help me solve my problem, right? So it's not just innovation in terms of, hey, we've got a new technology, a new sensor, a new camera, but it's also innovation in how to apply that to solve a set of problems that the people who designed the sensor, the technology, may not have even thought about. And so that's really fascinating. And so we're trying to make sure, how can we continue to enable that innovation and growth to happen in a sustainable manner, and then figure out how we connect that to the challenges going on Earth.
And how do you do that in practice? I mean, what does that actually mean on the ground?
A lot of discussion.
Or not on the ground?
I mean, we're a small nonprofit, and our focus is mainly working with stakeholders in industry. We also work with governments. We work with the United Nations on trying to facilitate the discussions between the entities that have the technology capabilities and those that are on the needing end, and build those bridges. And in some cases, it's a matter of just facilitating a discussion. In other cases, it's a matter of raising awareness among policymakers about a particular opportunity, and then trying to shape a policy in a direction that's going to enable that. So that's a lot of what we do.
When Bill Gates retired from Microsoft and set out to kind of figure out the best way to use his fortune, he famously did this calculation where he wanted to see where an incremental dollar would make the most difference, and it turned out to be vaccination, 40 cents save a life, and he said there's no deal on earth better than that. So that's a sort of bang for the buck question. Where do you see, as far as the use of space technology, the opportunity to make the biggest difference to the largest number of people? Where's the big opportunity? Because broadband is nice, but are there kind of more basic things around agricultural extension or things like that?
I mean, for us, I think it's still a bit bigger question we in the space world know a lot about what is coming, the kind of technology being developed. We don't always know where they can be applied. And the people that are working on the ground doing development, managing ecosystems, or tracking climate, don't always know what the space world is. So I still think the biggest bang for the buck is going to be in putting those communities together and fostering those conversations.
And letting them figure out exactly what the applications are.
Absolutely, and working on software analytical techniques that can actually turn all these space capabilities into something that people on the ground can find useful. I think there's still quite a bit of work we can do in that area.
Okay. So Dirk, I want to come to you next. And this is a straightforward, business opportunity for Airbus, presumably. Where do you see the big opportunities for commercializing space and to make life better on Earth?
Many of the topics were mentioned by Dario. It's about data. It's of course about connectivity. As you might know, we are investors in OneWeb, and we are also producers of the satellite, the 900 satellite constellation, which will enable exactly the 4 billion people that have no internet access to have affordable access in the future.
And what's the state of play with OneWeb? Are you, when is the first launch expected?
It should be next year. But what is interesting, it also changed the way of working for us, because today we produce like 15 telecommunication satellites per year, and then we have to produce 15 in a week.
Right.
That means 2 satellites a day. This changed our way of producing satellites. It went into industrial production. So it
So you're
changed
already
everything.
piling them up somewhere in anticipation.
Yeah, so it's mind-blowing, it's changing, and of course with that, it also gives new opportunities for, not only for data connectivity, but also for Earth surveillance. What is also, I think, for us very important is the monitoring of the climate change. We have many satellites that we can use for CO2 monitoring. We can have just launched on 13 October a new monitoring satellite for Earth's pollution. So there are many ways that we can help to monitor what's going on in the world. And maybe also what is interesting is, and this is enabled by digitalization and the exponential speed of transformation that we see coming through IT, giving us new opportunities for business models like the deforestation monitoring. Mm-hmm. For example, we work together with Forest Trust and Saab Vision in order to help companies that are working with the palm industries, which is one of the major contributors to deforestation, to monitor the agriculture fields that are used. Today, they send people around, flying around the globe, trying to monitor what's going on their supplier base, and we can use satellite data to make that much easier to follow and, of course, also to monitor change immediately.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very big change in mindset for you. It's more like a Silicon Valley mindset about manufacturing and scale and so on. How has that, has the company embraced that eagerly, or is this a very different way of looking at the world?
It's you see, we prefer to disrupt ourselves. It is something we have to face. It will not stop, it will not slow down, it will even accelerate. And we have to prepare our teams to work with the new technologies. I think we have, you see, it's not so easy. We come from a mindset of first time right. You cannot afford mistakes on a satellite because you have no way of correcting it. Our big satellites are hundreds of millions of investments, and you take the risk of the launch, and then you operate them for 15 years. And if you cannot operate them 15 years, you pay a penalty. So for us, it's first time right is really based in our DNA. And now to say we do everything faster, we do it differently, we take a new way of working, but still to keep the first time right is, of course, very disruptive.
To try to have the best of both. Laurie, I'd like to come to you and ask you about this from your perspective as a former deputy minister at NASA. Does Earth sort of get the short straw here? Everyone wants to go to the moon and Mars, and actually missions to Earth, should we be placing more of an emphasis on that?
Well, I absolutely believe we should be, but in a way that's maybe a little different than you're intending to ask it. For me, your government tax dollar should be invested in a way that returns money to the Earth, that helps people on the Earth, like we saw in the video, and we should be leveraging tax dollars completely differently than we do. The commercial space is a misnomer. We've had many, many companies in space for a long time, but the percentage that we spend in the government should be reduced as we incentivize and drive down risk for these companies to be able to do the amazing things that will return to Earth. So of course, Earth Sciences would love to have a bigger budget, but honestly, spending $1 billion a satellite on an Earth Sciences mission, that's not what we should be doing with it anyway. We should be driving those technologies that can be adapted and adopted by the companies who have the incentives to grow these markets. So you just ask them what those markets are. They don't know. I'm on the Maxar board, by the way, full disclosure. When we met last week and I learned some of the technologies now with Digital Globe and Radiant, I could think of 10 different things. I'm in the commercial aviation world now. Right. Really? You can measure turbulence in real time? There might be a market for that. These are things that it's the technology and the market, and we can't decide. The government should be spending its money in ways, even to go to Cassini, to drive the technologies and put out bids so many people, many companies, can go try to do it.
So what does that mean in practice? Where should governments be spending then? What does that actually mean?
They should be spending their money on advanced technologies, not missions themselves, for the most part.
So capabilities, not missions, what we heard earlier on. Yeah.
And even the very inspiring words of Carolyn Porco are things that NASA could be doing, the government could be doing in a way that not only got there for less money, but were more inspiring, because you could drive those technologies. We spend many billions of dollars on these missions. Look at something like Webb. You could incentivize companies with hundreds of millions to go, get 5 of them, and someone would be successful. We just heard you can't have any risk. You've got to be 100%. Well, in a mature technology, that is true. But we should be driving in the government immature technologies and allow companies to go see what works, and then that will determine what the applications are, and all those applications are for us here on Earth. Whether we learn about human trafficking or water resources, the atmosphere, or how as humans we relate to the universe. That could all be done in a way that is much more productive and innovative and returns benefits to people on this planet.
Brian, I wanted to bring you in here because you have a military background, and the kind of canonical example, I think, of what Laurie's just suggested would be, say, something like GPS, where it's something that the government built and developed and funded, and then it had these very nice commercial, civilian spillover effects. And so I imagine that's the sort of thing that you have in mind. But isn't it the case that, I mean, Mark Andreessen likes to talk about a reversal of polarity. It used to be the case that government and military users got stuff first, and then it slowly, trickled down to us, and we got GPS, 20, 25 years later. But that's not really the way things work anymore. I mean, the consumer electronics markets are now so much bigger that actually it's going the other way around, and you have people in Iraq flying drones using Xbox controllers because it's cheaper to buy one off the shelf than to build one. So is this kind of government invests in technology which trickles down, is that still actually a representation of how the world works today?
It's certainly changing. I mean, it's not 100% coming from outside in. The government still invests in some technologies where there is not a whole lot of commercial interest, but it's definitely changing. It's much different than it used to be. GPS is an interesting example because it was something the military built for a couple of specific military missions. And then there were others that said, hey, as Laurie kind of pointed out, we can use that for this and this and this. And that prompted a fairly significant policy fight within the US government over a couple of decades about whether or not it is a military system or whether it's a multi-user system. And eventually they said yes, and now there are civil agencies that have a say and a role in GPS, and it's become this fundamental part of our lives. And another interesting decision they made was they decided they were going to open up the end user segment of it, right? So the government controls the satellites and the ground stations, but they said, here is a standard, go out and build a receiver that can receive that. And so you've seen this amazing innovation in receivers that have gone from literally trucks to something the size of your thumbnail you put in a phone for less than $1. And that was a deliberate decision made by the government to kind of open that up towards innovation. So I definitely think it's changing. Is
that still a model? I mean, do we need the government to be the kind of anchor tenant for new technologies like that?
So I think there are some technologies where the commercial is going to drive it. There are still some probably that I can think of where the main user and interest is still the government. A big part of what we're seeing in the space world is, you can kind of generalize the history of IT as a lot of work done in the Apollo era on software and computer chips got spun off, and now it's coming back to the space world multiple generations of Moore's Law later and having a huge impact on the space world. Not only just the circuits and the chips, but also the cloud computing and the software and services. So if it's relying on IT, I think that's going to come probably from the commercial sector. But there are things with optics, there are things with antennas, where there is still the primary interest is still coming kind of from the national security world. Right. So that's still going to be for a while. It's never going to be 100% all coming from commercial. But the balance is definitely.
So that's
that's precisely the point that I was trying to make, is it has flipped. And the government, just think if 10 years ago we'd invested in optical comm, would your companies have benefited from that? Would you now be in a better position to return money to the economy? You bet. But we didn't, because we were buying our own missions, because we wanted to build them ourselves. We should be leveraging that. You mentioned drones. It's the perfect example. I was at the Drone Advisory Council yesterday for the FAA in downtown Seattle at Amazon Prime Air. And people around the table don't work for the government. They're in industries that we would never have guessed. But they are driving the applications because the technology has advanced. All the government is trying to do is not over-regulate it. And that will be the hardest part. That is the biggest challenge today, is how is the government going to interact with privacy rights and safety of our airspace? And they're not trying to develop it. So I just really think fundamentally we need to shift how we invest our public dollars in these areas. In other areas of the economy, we don't try to compete with the private sector, but we live in this time when we yearn for the days of Apollo and big missions and the people at these agencies who are wonderful. Leading the agency was a dream job of my life, but we should be allowing them to do it in ways that benefit us more.
Dario, I appreciate, in fact, I want to ask both of you about this, satellite companies, but I appreciate you can't give us details, but is it the case that the demands that are made on you by national security agencies or whatever, or those sorts of uses are pulling along what the consumer applications are subsequently capable of doing?
It's a profound question, actually, because if you think about the evolution of what is happening, particularly on the satellite industry itself, now with this, call it new entrants or new applications, you can put up a nanosat, a CubeSat. I mean, all this idea of having a satellite that needs to last 15 years, like we did in GEO for long, many decades, right? If you start relaxing the original, call it, requirements that was driven by, arguably, technologies that were not flexible enough, if you start injecting right now more and more commercial level thinking, and you start saying, the satellite doesn't need to last 15 years. I don't need to put all of them in GEO. I can start doing a lot with the entire IT and computer industry behind me. I think we can actually accelerate a lot of applications, a lot of new, both on the ground and in the space, actually satellites. And this idea of the government partnership, I don't know, I think done the right way can really move the needle. I'll give you an example right now, right? We are in partnership with DARPA to do the RSGS, right? The robotic satellite to be able to serve. There are about 500 or so GEO satellites right now.
Right.
There are about 80 that we put up there ourselves. There is no infrastructure in the planet that doesn't have a way to service it. So it's about time, right, that we put together these technologies, and if it needs to come with the help of some missions that maybe are envisioned by a government agency, but we can immediately find the collaboration to be able to create a business out of it, I think that sounds to be a model.
Is that the sort of thing that you approve of then, Laurie? That's the kind of thing that you think we should be funding?
100%.
Yeah. Dirk, what about you? What's your take on the kind of private sector, public sector collaboration and what the right balance is there?
We see a strong shift in the last 30, 40 years. 30, 40 years ago, it was tremendously influenced by military aspects, and innovation was very much driven from military. What we see that if we compare today, and we also looked at the statistic in Europe, it's just the inverse. 80% of the innovation come from the private side and from the IT side, and accelerating. So I think especially with the digitalization, we see innovation speed has a really huge impact. We see that there are efforts in order to have a stronger impact by government investment and military investments and innovations again. So I think that will be balancing out a bit, but compared to 30, 40 years ago, it is just the inverse.
Given what these companies can do, if the government builds another remote sensing or communication satellite, they are stealing from the American people and from our future. It is not something that they need to be doing anymore. And I'm sort of sad on the civil side in recognizing that the military side is doing it better. They've been buying data much earlier than NASA. We want to build Landsats. We want to build TDRS. Oh, do we just order another TDRS? Makes me crazy.
What do you think about this, Brian?
There's mostly you can get. So for example, the US military is currently thinking about its next generation of basically wideband communication satellites and whether it buys them itself or whether it just buys it as a service. I think it clearly makes sense to buy it as a service. But there's another application they have, which is satellites that are hardened basically to survive in a nuclear war. And that is a much different thing that's much harder to get as to just buy it off the shelf, right? So that's what I was saying. That I think there's a bulk of the applications. I think you're right. You can probably buy them from industry or buy them as a service, but there's still going to be that core niche of applications that doesn't really exist because it's a very exquisite set of requirements, and the government's going to have to do some of its own things there. But you're right, the bulk of it.
And they could do that differently in a way that does return more benefit also.
And we have a perfect example, by the way. If you think about cybersecurity in the traditional, so to speak, non-space world, there used to be a time where the government was way ahead when it came to encryption technologies and being able to have their own algorithms and devices. I would argue right now that the commercial side of it is way more advanced in cybersecurity than ever the government can be right now, and so the collaboration between the two, actually, I think is a classic example of how you could truly move the needle when you collaborate up front, as opposed to having this serial effect of first I invest in government, then in commercial, and then hopefully.
And so it's hard to think about what the government could do to infuse that next generation. And aviation is a good example. I think the $1.5 trillion income that we get to our economy here in the US from it, the FAA, I think, spends, if you don't include the money they get from the fuel tax and so forth, maybe $1 billion a year. So the leverage on that is incredible, but they're still doing it. And NASA still has less than $1 billion, about $500 million of aeronautics research to drive that technology. They need to work better with the private sector so they aren't investing in things that either we've already moved on from, or you're already ahead of us.
So one of the areas that NASA's doing that is with the sort of air traffic control for drones and that sort of thing. And again, that's an enabling infrastructure that will allow the private sector to do things.
Yeah, we'll see if they can keep up.
Yeah.
From the meeting yesterday, the time is marching on, and companies like Amazon Prime Air and Google are not going to wait for the government.
But don't they have to wait because it's illegal?
It's not clear that it is. It's not clear that it is, because some of this is Wild West. There's some Supreme Court cases about where, is there a line of privacy, and I think we'll be driving those questions in real time.
It's the drone falling on your head. I mean, I'm very interested in this, having looked into drones earlier this year. A lot of the people going into that space are internet companies who are used to a build it now, regulate it later model, and that's not something you can apply when you have physical things flying through the air, whether they're rockets or satellites or drones. So it's
true. They were asking me about the commercial space analogy, and that, we did that a little. We pushed it, and then the regulators come along. I said, yeah, that didn't involve like every single person on the planet and being at risk.
Yeah.
I think that's it's going to be a bigger challenge.
Okay, we'll see. Right now, we have a polling question, which we'd like to put to you all. So I don't know if you've gone and had a look at it already, but the next polling question is about where you think the greatest opportunity, commercial opportunity, is here. We've heard about telecoms. Obviously, something happens a lot at the moment, but all of these plans to build multi-thousand satellite broadband constellations. Tourism, we haven't touched on that one, actually. Maybe we should, actually, we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that later on today. And third, we've put business intelligence. I think, actually, in retrospect, I probably ought to have put that as remote sensing. But it was an attempt to sort of try and capture the imaging and other sensing that's possible. So please give us your thoughts there on those. And I just wanted, while we wait for the results to come in, and I think we also have some questions from the app as well. We'll come to those in a sec. I just wanted to come back to you, Laurie, one more time on the aviation analogy. What was how did that work? Because that was a sort of setting a framework. But can we learn from the way that aviation, we're surrounded by all these beautiful aircraft from the early days of aviation, and it's sort of very tempting. It went from something that, getting into an aircraft in the beginning of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, you were mad, and then it became totally mundane by the end of the century, and you can sort of imagine the same thing happening with space travel in this century. So what lessons, if any, are there about the government's role in making that commercial opportunity come alive?
Yeah, I think we are trying to adopt those lessons. There's a number of analogies. The initial sort of Curtis versus the Wrights, and who was more willing to share their intellectual property, and trying to get the government to actually was behind, and for years would not buy contracts, ultimately did. What they did right in the government, which we are now doing, the Kelly Airmail Act. So being able to just say, we'll pay you to deliver the mail, instead of we're going to make the plane. That happened so early in the aviation industry, and it's just now happening in space.
Right. So that's
so
what the ISS cargo resupply is. It is the airmail for the...
And we have the perfect situation now. There's still a government aviation need, and certainly that is a very minor part of overall aviation. So I think when space gets there, then we will move on to the next thing.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question from the floor. We haven't mentioned climate change, really. And so the question from the floor is, what do the panelists think about climate change, weather forecasting, agriculture, and so on, and to what extent can they benefit from improvements in space tech? This might be one for you, Brian.
Well, it plays a huge role. I mean, most of what we know about how the climate is changing is coming from satellites that are observing the Earth. And many of those are being flown by NASA or ESA and the other civil space agencies. So it's a huge part of how we figure about it, how we learn about what the climate.
Do we need more data on? I mean, do we have the answer now?
We can analyze the data we have.
You need probably more good data, right? I mean, a big part of that question is, how does the data we get line up to historical data? How do you calibrate it? How do you make sense of it? You can't just throw lots and lots of random data in a pile and make sense of it in a lot of cases. So I think there's a big discussion going on about that, and whether the role of commercial comes into there. There's a discussion in the US about possibly buying data from commercial companies that are doing things like GPS occultation as a way to feed future weather forecasting models, as opposed to governments building more satellites.
Right.
That's a big policy.
Is that something that either of you you're supplying, that kind of new data, that sort of data exhaust, if you like, from the existing infrastructure that you have?
Yeah, we deliver many of the instruments, all the satellites that do the monitoring. And what we see, for example, we just delivered the CO2 module for the CNES microcap satellite. But the problem is it is, of course, fantastic to have a new level of CO2 monitoring, but you need then an end-to-end integration in order to analyze what you want to do with the data. Just to have the data doesn't make it a better case. So,
well, the sharp end of this, obviously, is the impact of climate change on agriculture and the extent to which more data can help with that. I mean, obviously, it's a very big problem that needs to be attacked from lots of different angles, but is that something that you're involved in?
Yeah, in particular, what I'm extremely excited, actually, if you think about the cloud technologies, analytics, machine learning, there is now an opportunity to bring the insights not just to big agencies or big commercial corporations, actually, but to finally situations where you might have, the family in the middle of Australia figuring out how to have the patch to do their, sheep grazing, right? Or you can have the winemakers figuring out what is going to be the situation or the temperature changing. I mean, I find to be a quantum leap beneficial to not just the usual traditional selected few, big pocketed corporations, but now finally, particularly if you think about how cloud is pervasive in the software and techniques, you can have your software, fifth grader, so to speak, have access to data and being able to actually create an application. I think that's going to be phenomenal when it comes to all the data being able to use that way.
So the #1 climate scientist, Jim Hansen, he ran the Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York for NASA, told me during transition team, so that was 9 years ago, our budget for $1 billion a year would be wasted with new satellites. We did not have the analytical tools and ability to model the complex interactions from the data we have to address this issue. He said, put it all into the analytics. And I'm sorry, maybe this is being broadcast, but maybe we could just tell Trump we've zeroed the Earth Sciences budget and we put it in another budget, and we could make more advancements than we have on climate change. What do you think?
I think he might not be that interested in making advances on climate change.
That's my point. We're calling it something else. It's analytical tools for the future.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Right. Well, maybe it's worth a try. Right. Do we have more questions from the floor? And can I see you if we do? That is the question. We have a question from a gentleman over here. Thank you. There will be a microphone making its way to you. This is my idea for a startup, which I really must get on with, which is a flying drone microphone for conferences that can instantly zip its way.
I can think of several safety challenges.
Yeah, I can think of some big problems with that. So there you go. But it's indoors, you see, so I'm not sure the FAA gets to put its nose in. Go ahead.
Actually, there is something close to that. I've seen in a couple of meetings. There's a microphone in a like a cube that's made
Yeah,
of
I've seen that. And
foam. It's actually pretty
saw
cool.
someone get whacked to the head with it. At which point they decided it wasn't such a great idea. So I don't know what your experience was, but
I didn't get hit. It was all right.
Anyway, go ahead.
My name is Bill Diamond from the SETI Institute, and I do want to kind of really emphasize the point you've been making about the data analytics. We run a summer workshop for NASA called FDL, which brings together machine learning expertise and deep science expertise to look at NASA science questions. We're actually in conversation with NASA Ames about going to SMD at headquarters and proposing that the next mission budget be applied to data analytics and machine learning, because there's more data from past missions that has yet to be analyzed and mined. That with a little bit of investment in a smart way on machine learning and data analytics could really revolutionize our understanding with money already spent. We spend new money on new missions, and we create more data that we don't have time or bandwidth to
And
look at.
beyond NASA, if you did this, now we have this great thing in the Space Council, and Scott Pace being there will completely get this, to take not only the NASA information, but the military data, commercial data. It would be amazing.
Yeah.
It would.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a look at the results of our survey, of our poll, our second poll, and see what you think about the relative. Okay, so at the moment it's all about the remote sensing, and with telecoms bringing up the in second place, and I think that's reasonable. Now, here's what I want to ask: what ought we have had as the fourth and fifth categories on here? Because we've talked about some of these, but what did we miss out? What am I not seeing here? What are the other opportunities? Go ahead.
Research and development for materials.
Materials. Okay, so this is and this would be humans in orbit, that kind of, the kind of thing we heard about in the...
Microgravity for crystallography,
right.
magnetic stressing.
Okay, any other bids for areas where, industries that will be most affected by space tech that we haven't got in our three category first take here? Or indeed any other questions?
Anything that uses mobility. So the combination of data from telecoms, remote sensing, GPS.
Right, so autonomous vehicles, for example.
Sure. Sure.
Sorry? Oh, we have someone over here. Go ahead. And I think then we have someone over here. So we're going to go over here, then we're going to go over here. So it's very hard for me to see, though, because I have kind of concentration camp lights pointing at me over here.
Sunglasses.
So it's Escape from Stalag Luft 3 or something.
It could be space traffic control, SSA, space situational awareness, avoiding objects, collisions, debris.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a necessary but not sufficient. Well, it's something we have to do.
And we are seeing that. I mean, that historically, again, has been something that was done by the government, mostly the military. And now there's at least a couple dozen commercial companies that are raising money to go do their own tracking, and they're doing a very good job of it. So,
and we have a session on that later on today. So that's does that create a new opportunity, or does it just ensure that these other opportunities can go ahead without disaster?
I mean, it's sort of like, to go back to the air traffic analogy, it's sort of an enabler to make sure we can use it all. We're not going to screw up the space environment. It is yet to be proven whether it's a valid business model. But there's plenty of money trying to figure out if that is true or not.
Okay, we had another question over here, and then I think we had a hand up over there again. So let's go over here next. Here we go. Run back and forth.
Hi, I'm Andre Watson. I work on a lot of nanobio stuff, and I think in particular that's an industry that's going to have a big influence on space, and also that you can pilot a lot of technologies. Like there was a question earlier about radio protectives, for example. If I deliver a gene using a nanoparticle into your bone marrow so that you're resistant to radiation or your bones get thicker, or that sort of thing, we actually just applied for a bunch of NASA grants for that. But I think that's an industry that right now, we're poking at, can we sequence something in space? Can we do this in space? Can we do imaging of cells in space? But tying all that together to actually have cohesive platforms for bioengineering, I think that's kind of the next frontier.
So you think there'll be spin-offs from medicine that is done in order to help people live and work in space that will have benefits on Earth?
Oh, 100%. I mean, the phase 3 Amgen drug for postmenopausal osteoporosis that I believe just got approved.
Yes, it was mentioned earlier on, yeah.
Yeah, it was mentioned briefly earlier. That was studied in space first. And we actually did a gene deletion of the same thing that targets in mice. So like that can be applied to space engineering.
Yeah,
Right, okay.
I always thought that was a crazy thing to happen. We'd study something for 3 astronauts that might go to Mars, and it would solve something for millions. We didn't focus on the millions to start. I mean, we'll take it, right? But the space station was really sold on some of these benefits, and there have been a couple things that have worked out, but biotech being one, they had a laboratory where you could test metabolites on human tissue to be able to see if they metabolize differently, and if you could find a drug that was benefited by the microgravity environment, that would absolutely be a future industry.
Cool. Okay, and I think we have one more question over here. There's a hand somewhere over here. Yes, a woman over there. Can we have a flying microphone over there, please?
I'm Yuri Koshara from Sprint. Actually, my thoughts were exactly to the lines what the gentleman was saying, but actually, if you explore on it, it's healthcare in general, and it's also actually will be extending our lives. So if we, for example, exchange our bones for lighter bones, for example, there's a vision we could live much longer, beyond 100 years and so on. And then at a certain point in time, there becomes the balance between our bodies, physical bodies, and our mental psyche becomes a problem. So I would also say healthcare in the sense of mental healthcare as well. So where is the quality of life actually taking us? That kind of thought actually would become an industry that's, I think, not as big now.
Okay, anyone else want to chip in with any other? Go ahead. I think if only we had two. Oh, hang on, we have a microphone next to. Okay, let's go over here, and then we'll go over here. Go ahead over there. It's hard for me to see what exactly is going on.
I'm Jasper Dhaliwal from the FedEx Institute of Technology. You know, I like to draw attention to something what I call very near space and really old problem. You know, it still takes us 18 hours to get from here to Singapore, or to move a package from Anchorage to Timbuktu, you know, takes us 12 hours. So in some ways, all these technologies for deep space and even the orbital nature, if you can apply them to solve these two, that's a business model just sitting there to be mined, that then can be used for deep space
Right, so the suborbital hops.
Well, it has surprised me that the companies, maybe we'll hear more from George at lunch, but the Virgin and Blues don't talk about point-to-point. That's clearly the market.
Yeah, well, Elon Musk just started talking about it.
My pilots are ready to go through space to deliver you to your destination of choice.